Zain gave a wide knowing smile, revealing his new teeth. Because my nurse took a fancy to me. There is no God but God, exclaimed Abdul Hafiz. You good for nothing. Were you even flirting with the nurses? Zain's body shook with stifled laughter. Oh, yes. Believe me, she was quite a wench. Hamad Wadrayas, who up to now had been listening and laughing but not saying anything, intervened with, The Prophet bless you, Zain. Give us a description of her. Zain looked behind him as though frightened that someone might overhear him and lowered his voice. God save us, men. She had quite a backside on her. The thread of the conversation was broken for a time as the assembly rocked with laughter. When Hamad Wadrayas had recovered his breath, though vestiges of laughter still remained in his chest, he said, What did you do to her, you rascal? The wench was from Durman, Zain continued, as though not having heard the last question. She was smooth-cheeked without cuts. Wadrayas crawled up close to Zain and repeated his question in another form. And how did you come to know she had a large backside? Zain immediately retorted, Did they tell you I am blind? Can't I see what's right there in front of me? Mahjub, delighted at the reply and looking at Wadrayas, said, The scoundrel knows what's what. Zain put his hands behind his head and leaned backwards slightly. Then, with a mischievous smile on his face, he slowly said, Do you want to know, men, what I did to her? Eagerly, Wadrayas said, By the Prophet, Zain, tell us what you did to her. Zain's smile widened. Then he opened his mouth to speak, and some of the light from the large lamp hanging in Saeed's shop was reflected on his teeth. But suddenly, at a bound, he was on his feet, just as though he'd been stung by a scorpion. Up jumped Ahmed Ismail and Mahjub, Tahar Rawasi and Hamad Wadrayas. Hold on to him, shouted Abdul Hafiz. Zain, though, was quicker than them and in a flash had seized hold of his man, had raised him high in the air and thrown him to the ground. Then he tightened his grip on his throat. They all fell upon Zain, Ahmed Ismail seizing hold of his right arm, Abdul Hafiz of his left, with Tahar Rawasi taking him by the middle, and Hamad Wadrayas by his legs. Saeed, who was weighing out something in his shop, hurried out and also took hold of Zain's legs. Even so, they were not successful. There flowed into Zain's lean body an immensely terrifying strength with which no one could deal. All the inhabitants of the village knew of this fearful strength and stood in awe of it, and Zain's family did all they could to see he did not use it against anyone. They would shake in terror when they remembered how Zain had once seized a difficult calf by the horns, had lifted it from the ground like a bundle of hay, and had then swung it round and thrown it to the ground. How, too, in one of his fits of excitement, he had torn an acacia bush up by the roots as though it were a stick of maize. They all knew that this emaciated body concealed an extraordinary, superhuman strength, and that Saifuddin, the prey upon whom Zain swooped, was doomed. For a while, their various voices were intertwined. The he-donkey, I'll kill him, Zain was repeating angrily. Abdul Hafiz's voice was raised, tense and afraid. By the Prophet, Zain, for God's sake, let him be. Mahjub began swearing in desperation, and Ismail, the youngest and strongest of them, at a loss as to what to do next, bit Zain in the back. Tahar Rawasi, too, was a man famed for his strength and could swim the Nile back and forth, staying under the water for minutes on end, in his search for fish at night. His strength, though, was not in comparison with Zain's. Amidst their clamor, they heard a snorting sound emanating from Saifuddin's throat and saw him striking out at the air with his long legs. He's dead! He's killed him! shouted Mahjub. But suddenly a new voice, that of Hanin, rose calm and serene above the hubbub. Zain, the Blessed, may God be pleased with you. Zain released his grip and Saifuddin fell limply to the ground. The 6 men also dropped down in a heap, for Hanin's voice had surprised them and they had been taken unawares by Zain's sudden immobility. It was as though there had been a wall in front of them that had suddenly collapsed. A very short instant passed, something of the order of the twinkling of an eye, during which complete silence reigned, a silence that was inevitably a mixture of terror, consternation, and hope. After that, life once again welled up within them and they remembered Saifuddin. Their heads bent over him, and then Mahjub called out in a joyful, trembling voice, "Thanks to God! Thanks to God!" They carried Saifuddin off and put him on a bench in front of Sa'id's shop, and with the voices tense and low, they began bringing him back to life. Only then did they remember Zain and notice him sitting on his backside, his hands between his knees, with his head bowed. Hanin had placed his hand with extreme tenderness on Zain's shoulder and was talking to him in a voice firm but filled with love. "Zain, blessed one of God, why did you do it?" Mahjub came up and scolded Zain, but Hanin silenced him with a look. "If you hadn't come, Reverend Sheikh, he'd have killed him," Mahjub said to Hanin after a while. Ahmed Ismail and Tahar Rawasi joined them, while Abdul Hafiz, Sa'id the merchant, and Wad Rayas stayed with Saifuddin. After a time, his head still bowed, Zain repeated what Mahjub had said. "If you hadn't come, Reverend Sheikh, I'd have killed him. The he-donkey, when he struck me on the head with an axe, did he think I'd let him get away with it?" There was no anger in his voice, the tone being more like that of his natural gaiety, though the others remained silent. They too were infected by this feeling of light-heartedness. "But you were in the wrong," said Hanin. Zain remained silent. "When did Saifuddin strike you on the head with an axe?" continued Hanin. "At the time of his sister's wedding," replied Zain, laughing, his face full of mirth. "What did you do to his sister on her wedding day?" "His sister had her eye on me. Why did they want to marry her off to that good-for-nothing fellow?" Ahmed Ismail could not help laughing. "All the girls are after you, blessed one of God," Hanin said in a more gentle and tender voice. "Tomorrow you'll be marrying the best girl in the village." Mahjub felt a slight palpitation of his heart. Having an innate awe of religious people, especially ascetics like Hanin, he used to remove himself from their path and have nothing to do with them. Yet he took warning of their predictions, feeling, despite his lack of outward concern, that they had mysterious powers. "The predictions of such ascetics are not made fruitlessly," he would say to himself. It was perhaps this that made him say in a loud voice tinged with contempt, "Who would marry this imbecile? On top of everything, he was going to commit a crime." Hanin gave Mahjub a stern look, and though Mahjub trembled inwardly, he did not show his fear. "Zain's no imbecile," said Hanin. "Zain's a blessed person. Tomorrow he'll be marrying the best girl in the village." Suddenly Zain gave an insolent, childish laugh and said, "I wanted to kill him, the he-donkey of a man, splitting me open with an axe just because his sister had her eye on me." "Now we want you to make it up," said Hanin firmly. "Let it end there. It's over and done with. He hit you, and now you've hit him." He called Saifuddin, whose tall form approached, surrounded by Sa'id, Abdul Hafiz, and Hamad Wad Rayas. "Get up and kiss him on the head," Hanin said to Zain, and without protest Zain got up, took hold of Saifuddin's head and kissed him. Then he bent over Hanin's head and covered it with kisses, saying, "Our Sheikh Hanin, our father, blessed of God." It was a stirring moment that silenced them all. Saifuddin's eyes were wet with tears. "I have wronged you," he said to Zain. "Forgive me." He got up and kissed Zain's head, then seized Hanin's hand and kissed it. All the men came along: Mahjub, Abdul Hafiz, Hamad Wad Rayaz, Tahar Rawasi, Ahmed Ismail, and Saeed the merchant. Each silently took hold of Hanin's hand and kissed it. "God bless you. God bring down his blessings upon you," said Hanin in his soft, unassuming voice, and he rose and took up his pitcher. "You must dine with us tonight," Mahjub quickly invited him. Hanin, though gently, refused. Clasping Zain's shoulder with the other hand, he said, "Dinner's to be in the house of the Blessed One." And the two of them made off into the darkness. For an instant, a shaft of light from the lamp hanging in Saeed's shop flickered above their heads, then slipped off them as a white silk gown slips from a man's shoulders. Mahjub looked at Abdul Hafiz, Saeed looked at Saifuddin, and they all exchanged looks and nodded their heads. Long years after this incident, when Mahjub had become a grandfather many times over, as had Abdul Hafiz, Tahar Rawasi, and the rest, when Ahmed Ismail had become a father and his daughters had become of marriageable age, the inhabitants of the village used to look back on that year and on the incident with Zain, Hanin, and Saifuddin that had taken place in front of Saeed's shop. Those who had taken part in the incident remembered it with solemn awe, including Mahjub, who had never previously bothered about anything. The lives of each one of those 8 men, the participants in the incident, were affected in one way or another. In the days that were ahead of them, these 8 men were to go over the details of the incident among themselves thousands of times, and each time the events made a more magical impression. They would remember in amazement how Hanin had appeared to them from out of the blue at the moment, the very instant when Zain's grip had tightened on Saifuddin and he had all but throttled him. In fact, some of them insist that Saifuddin had actually died, had breathed his last, and had fallen to the ground a lifeless corpse. Saifuddin himself affirms this version and says that he did actually die. He says that the moment Zain's grip on his throat had tightened, he completely departed this world. He saw a vast crocodile the size of a large ox, with its mouth agape. The crocodile's jaws closed upon him. Then came a wave so large it seemed like a mountain, which bore off the crocodile with Saifuddin between its jaws into the valley that was the trough of the wave. And the crocodile plunged down into a vast bottomless pit. It was then, Saifuddin says, that he saw death face to face, and Abdul Hafiz, the person closest to Saifuddin when he recovered consciousness, is adamant that the first words he uttered on breath coming anew to his lungs, the first thing he said on opening his eyes was, "I bear witness that there is no God but God, and I bear witness that Muhammad is the messenger of God." At any event, there is no doubt that from that moment Saifuddin's life underwent a change undreamt of by anyone. Saifuddin was the only son of Badawi the jeweler, so named because he had followed this trade at the beginning of his life. And when he had grown rich and was no longer a jeweler, the name had inevitably stuck to him. Badawi was well off, possibly the richest man in the village. Some of his wealth he had collected by the sweat of his brow from his trade as a goldsmith, from commerce and traveling about. Some had come to him from his wife. He was, as the village folk expressed it, a man with a green arm, who touched nothing without it turning to money. In less than 20 years, he had built up a fortune from scratch, partly in the lands and estates, partly in goods distributed along the length of the Nile from Karima to Karma, partly in the form of boats loaded with dates and merchandise plying up and down the river, partly in the shape of the great mass of gold worn by his wife and daughters in the way of jewelry covering their necks and arms. Saif ad-Din was brought up an only son among 5 daughters, pampered by his mother, pampered by his father, and pampered by his 5 sisters. He could not but be spoiled, or as the village folk put it, he could not but become soft and flabby like the tree that grows in the shade of a bigger tree, being exposed to no winds and not seeing the light of the sun. Badawi died with a bitter lump of disappointment in his throat because of his son. He had spent a lot of money on his education, but the boy had done no good. He had set him up in the village in a business which had failed within a month. After this, he had put him into a workshop to learn a trade, but he had run away. In the end, by bringing influence to bear, he had succeeded in having him appointed as a junior government employee, hoping that he would learn to stand on his own feet. But no more than a few months later, a succession of reports came, both from the mouths of enemies and friends, from those who enjoyed such misfortunes and those who were well-wishers, that his son was spending all his nights in a wine shop, and was seen at office only once or twice a week, and that his superiors had warned him time and time again, threatening him with dismissal. The father had therefore set off for the city, to return herding along his son like a captive, having sworn he would keep him imprisoned in the fields his whole life long, like a man in bondage. Those were his words. And so Saif ad-Din had spent a year collecting fodder for the cows, pasturing the cattle on the fringes of the fields all day long, sowing and harvesting, chopping wood and grumbling. Even so, he did not lack amusement of an evening, for he knew of places where liquor was made, and would frequent the girls who used to make it, the sluts, as the villagers called them. These girls were slaves who had been given their freedom, some of them having migrated from the village and married far away from the locality of their bondage. Others had married freed slaves in the village and led a respectable life, a continuing affection existing between them and their former masters. Some of them, however, not finding a settled life easy, had stayed on the perimeter of life in the village, a place of call for those bent on pleasure and sensual enjoyment. The fact was that this rendezvous of ex-slave girls was something alien that contained the spirit of adventure and rebellion. It represented a departure from the familiar. There, on the edge of the desert, far from the village, squatted their houses made of straw, and at night, when people had gone to bed, beams of lamplight flickered from their doorways and windows, and drunken laughter could be heard. In their displeasure, the inhabitants of the village burned them down, but they returned to life like the alpha plant that will not die. Though the villagers drove away those who inhabited these houses, tormenting them in a variety of ways, they soon got together again, like flies alighting upon a dead cow. How many an adolescent young man's heart had throbbed in the darkness as the night brought him the sounds of female laughter and the shouts of intoxicated men. In that oasis on the edge of the desert, there was something frightening, something delightful yet intimidating that tempted one to reconnoiter. It was not difficult for Saif ad-Din to find his way to it. There he would spend his nights, for he had taken one of the women as his mistress. All this his father bore patiently. When reports came to him about his son, he would sometimes pretend to take no notice. At other times, he would fly into a rage. But his patience came to an end when, one night as he sat on his prayer mat after performing the evening prayer, Saifuddin came to him reeking of liquor. In a voice made hoarse from the effects of drink and lack of sleep, Saifuddin announced that he was in love with and wanted to marry Sarah, one of the ex-slave girls. The father saw red and lost control. His only son, a dissolute drunkard, informing him as he sat on his prayer mat that he was in love, a phrase that conjured up in the minds of fathers in the village all the concepts of idleness, indolence, and lack of manliness, and that he wanted to marry some brazen, immoral slave girl. The father rose and set about giving his son a thorough good beating. Along came the mother, wailing loudly, at which people gathered and finally extricated the son from the father's hands, more dead than alive. The father swore that the dissolute boy, as he expressed it, was not to spend another single night under his roof, and that he disowned him as a son. Saifuddin spent the night at his uncle's house, vanishing the next morning. Jeweler Badawi passed the rest of his life like a man stricken with some infirmity. Pain bit into his heart, and his face became as thin and emaciated as a consumptive's. He used to say that his son had died, when sometimes by a slip of the tongue he mentioned his son, and he did so as though he had in actual fact died. Dreadful reports about Saifuddin were continually being received of how he had been sent to prison in Khartoum on charge of larceny, of how he had once been accused in Port Sudan of killing a man and would have been hanged had the real murderer not eventually been found, and of how he lived like an out-and-out desolate wastrel with the prostitutes of every town in which he stayed. Once he was reported to be working as a laborer carrying bales of cotton on his back in the port. Another time that he was a lorry driver between Fashar and Ubaid. On yet other occasions he was said to be cultivating cotton at Tokar. His uncles on both sides of the family tried to persuade his father to write a will leaving his fortune to his wife and daughters. All sensible men in the village also held that this was the right thing to do, but the father continually shirked it, explaining that he would do so when he felt his end drawing near, and that he was still in good health and was in no need of writing a will. These men used to shake their heads in distress and say that Badawi was still hoping his son would return to his senses. Something incomprehensible to the inhabitants of the village stopped the man from taking the decisive step of cutting his son off from his inheritance. Then, one night in the month of Ramadan, Badawi died seated on his prayer mat after having performed the special late night prayers for this month. He was a good man, and he died the death of all good men in the month of Ramadan, in the final third of it, the most blessed part, on his prayer mat after having performed the special Ramadan prayers. The people of the village shook their heads and said, "God have mercy on Badawi. He was a good man. He deserved a better son than that desolate one of his." One day, when the people were still in mourning and had just finished giving the prescribed alms, Saifuddin made his appearance. He carried a thick stick of the sort used in the east of the Sudan, and had no luggage whatsoever. His hair was ruffled as a sayal acacia tree, his beard thick and dirty, and his face that of a man who has come back from hellfire. He gave greeting to no one, and all eyes avoided him. However, his eldest uncle on his father's side walked up to him and spat in his face, and when the news of his arrival reached his mother in the other side of the house, where she was leading the women of the household in their mourning of the deceased, She broke into renewed wailing as though her husband had just died. Saifuddin's sisters broke into wailing, as did all his aunts, and the women's wing of the house fairly rocked with the din, until the eldest uncle went and rebuked them, at which they fell silent. All this did not prevent Saifuddin from getting his hands on his father's wealth. All the uncles managed to do was to rescue his mother's and sister's portions, leaving the greater part of the fortune in Saifuddin's hands. Here, too, began the life of torture for Musa, Zain's friend. Musa the Lame, as the village folk called him. Saifuddin turned him out on the pretext that as he was no longer a slave, he was not responsible for him. From then on, Saifuddin led an unrestrained life, made worse by the abundance of money he now possessed. He was continually away traveling, sometimes eastwards, sometimes westwards, spending a month in Khartoum, a month in Qahira, a month in Asmara, only coming home to the village to sell some land or dispose of a crop. He was a type of person the inhabitants of the village had never in their lives known, and they shunned him as they would a leper. Even those closest to him on both sides of the family did not feel safe having him in their homes, and would shut the door in his face lest he corrupt their sons or seduce their daughters. On one of his intermittent visits to the village, he found his sister's marriage in progress. His family kept away from their weddings, and he, by natural disposition, did not attend funerals. Because of him, that marriage was all but transformed into a tragedy. First of all, there was the incident of Zain. Along came Zain as usual with his gaiety and raillery, with no one paying him any heed. Saifuddin, however, taking exception to this, struck him on the head with an axe. The matter would have ended in prison had it not been for the intervention of the wise men of the village, who said that Saifuddin was not worth the time they would spend on him in the courts. Secondly, the bridegroom almost changed his mind at the last moment because he quarreled with Saifuddin, the bride's brother, and once again the wise men of the village, amongst them the bridegroom's father, gathered together and said that Saifuddin was not one of them, and that his attendance at the wedding was an unavoidable evil. Thirdly, in the last week of the marriage celebrations, tens of strangers whom no one had ever seen before descended upon the house. Brazen women and men with lascivious glances, vagabonds and insolent boors, who came from who knows where, friends of Saifuddin's, invited by him to his sister's wedding celebrations. At this point, the inhabitants of the village found themselves bound to do something. Thus, before these guests had settled in their seats, there entered a file of men from the village headed by Ahmed Ismail, and then Mahjub, followed by Abdul Hafiz, Tahar Rawasi, and Hamad Wad Rayas. Then all Saifuddin's uncles, about 30 men with stout sticks and hoes in their hands. Locking the doors behind them, they gave a good beating to all the intruders, and the best hiding of all they gave to Saifuddin. Then they threw them out into the street. While the whole village was in a turmoil from that affliction called Saifuddin, all of a sudden, following the Hanin incident, he changed as though born anew. To begin with, people couldn't believe their eyes, but every day Saifuddin did something new. First, they heard that he had gone early one morning to his mother, had kissed her head and wept lengthily before her. Hardly had they got over this than they heard he had brought together all his uncles and had repented and asked forgiveness in front of them, and that as an assurance of his repentance he had taken all that remained of his father's fortune from his own charge, and had made his senior paternal uncle a trustee over it, until he should become wholly fit for carrying out his responsibilities. No sooner had the inhabitants of the village accustomed their ears to that than to their amazement they saw Saifuddin repairing to the mosque for the Friday prayers. He had shaved off his beard and had his mustache neatly trimmed and was dressed in clean clothes. Those who attended the prayers said that when he heard the Imam's sermon, the subject of which was the honoring of one's parents, he burst into such lengthy weeping that he went into a swoon and the people flocked around to comfort him. On leaving the mosque, he had immediately gone to Musa the lame and telling him that he had acted wrongly towards him, had asked his forgiveness and informed him that he would treat him as his father used to do. For a month or so, the village never stopped gasping as every day it heard of some new act performed by Saifuddin. His abstaining from wine, his withdrawal from the company of his disreputable friends, his devoting himself to his prayers, his applying himself to reviving his father's business which he had undermined, his engagement to his cousin, and finally his resolution to perform the pilgrimage that year. Whenever Abdul Hafiz, who was one of those who believed most firmly in Hanin's miracles as evidence in Saifuddin, heard some fresh piece of news, he would hurry off to Mahjub, who was known for his distaste for religious people and in particular ascetics. A miracle, my friend, not a doubt about it. Mahjub would keep silent. In his belly a sensation of vague uneasiness assails him in such circumstances. Saifuddin has decided to go on the pilgrimage. By God, do you credit it, friend? Do you or don't you believe it? A miracle, friend, without the shadow of a doubt. At first, Mahjub used to say to Abdul Hafiz that Saifuddin had had enough of fooling about, or as he put it, his fooling about had reached the giddy limit, and that he was bound to make a change one day. But as he went on hearing something new and astounding each day, he no longer felt capable of disputing the matter and took refuge in silence.